Okay, welcome everyone to this seminar with Dr. Timothy Woods. To start off, we're just going to get a quick introduction to what the climate walks are from Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, can you please go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alina. I'm just going to talk for maximum of 2 minutes about the climate walks, which is an initiative which I'm working on with the GSI team. I'm a visiting fellow with GSI, and they are for all staff working on climate science policy and environmental research. So probably everybody in this room is very welcome to come. And there are 2 walks coming up, I think in the next week or so, or you might have even had a flyer through your email, but I'll give you the dates now. 22nd of June, Thursday at 1 till 2, and 13th of July, which is also a Thursday, 1 till 2. And the walks start from the XFI building, the business school. So what are the walks? They come from the Climate Psychology Alliance, which runs very successfully across the UK and beyond, climate cafes, which are reflective spaces where people can consider the thoughts and feelings that unfold as we live through the climate and ecological emergency. In relation to the work that we all do, and particularly the research that we all do as people affiliated with the GSI. And the format that we're trialing with you over the next 2 months are combining a walk with a session, a group session. It's not a therapy session at all. It's an informal setting to share the many different feelings and emotions that might arise through the work that you do and through your own sort of personal life. So it's connecting the personal with the work that you do as researchers. Like myself, some of you may have been researching in the field of climate for many, maybe decades, and some of the kind of more, I guess, complex emotional responses to that work can get hidden or buried and maybe slightly uncomfortable to try and articulate. But the work that we're doing psychologically with the Climate Psychology Alliance is proving that actually it's incredibly useful to start to share or try and articulate some of these responses. And so what we're doing is providing a really confidential and safe space to try and articulate these things and to then yield some of the positive impacts of sharing that on well-being and on work life. So please come along. Hopefully it'll be a sunny day, and we can, some of the time on the walk, we'll be enjoying the beautiful campus. It's during a lunchtime, so bring your lunch. And then we'd really love to also hear your feedback about the process and what you experience in that time. And if it's useful to you, we're finding that that really is useful for lots of people, but we'd love to hear from you. So if you can spare us an hour, that would be fantastic. And I look forward to meeting you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. Then we'll start the seminar. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Woods, who's a professor of agricultural economics and state extension specialist in the area of horticulture, agribusiness marketing, and management. He's devoted his time and energy to help facilitate the development of small agri-related businesses and cooperatives that have promising innovative processes and products. He served as the staff economist to the Kentucky Governor's Office for Agriculture Policy and Development Board. His work has been presented at numerous international workshops, professional meetings, and state and regional extension programs. He recently developed Market Ready, a nationally recognized best marketing practices education program for farmers selling to restaurants, groceries, and wholesale. This program is being used in 15 states. Most recently, he has helped lead a national project around COVID impacts on local food systems with USDA and 17 national local food sector networks. He is currently a visiting scholar within the Center for Rural Policy at the University of Exeter, and we're very pleased to welcome here today. Tim, if you can start.
Great, thank you, Elena, and appreciate this invitation to be with everybody today, and look forward to a chance to share some very recent research that we've been looking at here around some branding programs, and particularly relating to local sourcing and climate smart branding. This is just so hot off the press. We just had the graduate student that had helped us do this work just finish her defense just a few weeks ago, and a lot of this work still kind of in progress. So really a good timing, I think, to be able to share some of the results that we're seeing out of this, and really welcome insight and kind of direction and reaction from you all in this program. So I do need to be sure to give kudos to my colleague, Dr. Shuli Zhao, who's a co-investigator in this project, and Favor Sen, who's also been the graduate student working with me on this. But this whole area of branding, especially around these dairy products, has been something really interesting to follow. And there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of complexity, a lot of changes that are going on in our consumer spaces. I know there is over here in the UK. There's no way I'm going to get to all these things, but this is just to show some very high level. We could do a separate seminar on any one of these in terms of some of the specific challenges around marketing dairy products. What we've seen in the United States is a long, steady decline in demand for fluid milk, and the corollary growth of a lot of plant-based substitutes, which has left a lot of our dairy producers trying to figure out what's the way forward and what's the future. Where are we going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now in terms of the dairy business? Especially in the southeast part of the United States, we've seen big declines in dairy animal numbers. We've seen a lot of the really big areas that produce dairy involving much, much larger dairy herds. And so the challenge that we're facing right now is trying to think of the sort of economic viability for some of our lower scale, smaller scale, less intensive, and maybe sustainably oriented kinds of dairy operations. The other thing that is driving a lot of this question right now, and why we're looking particularly at the climate smart branding, is as many of you are very well aware, that animal and dairy products have been a lightning rod for their high carbon impact, their greenhouse gas emissions that come substantially from animal production practices. And so what could that look like? And are there opportunities for small scale, niche, sustainable agriculture oriented kinds of operations to differentiate themselves through those practices potentially? And so that's part of what we're trying to look at here with some of our branding. On the plus side, we've seen a lot of growth and opportunity emerge for a lot of our smaller scale dairy, with growth in the agritourism, destination experience opportunities, huge growth in interest in the local sourcing from buyers in many different market channels, and a lot of new opportunities for small scale, sustainable, certainly organic has been a big growing part of our dairy sector as well. And additionally, just as the food culture has evolved, there are a lot of opportunities for farm-based, artisanal, gourmet food options there. As we look at the local product scene, I'll just mention the local product scene and then say a few things about the carbon and climate scene here. When we think about the local product scene, just to provide you just a little bit of background on maybe some of the justification for why we're going to be looking at some of the branding options. In the United States, we have almost every state has a state Department of Agriculture that leads a branding program for state level food and agricultural products. So in Kentucky, you can see our Kentucky Proud label that gets connected to a lot of our local food and agricultural products. Tennessee, the state just south of us, has a Pick Tennessee program. There's Ohio Proud, Go Texan, Virginia's Finest. Almost every state has its own sort of state branding for local program. These can be very generic. They're not the same from state to state in terms of what they're trying to do, how well they're funded, the extent of participation. But the program in Kentucky is very well funded. It's just getting ready to celebrate its 20th anniversary for this label, and they've put a lot of money into promoting it. Very high level of awareness, as we'll see looking a little bit later. Something else just to keep in mind in terms of providing some context is very recently, within the past 5 years, the USDA has invested a lot of money into small to medium-sized dairy business development, trying to encourage initiative that would look at products, value-added products and enterprises beyond just the commodity milk programs. And so that's been part of where this funding has come from, to look at these kinds of things, to try to come alongside small-scale dairy producers that are looking for ways to differentiate in a very challenging market. There have been some programs. I've mentioned the Tennessee program with their State Department of Ag. They have had a program that has been running there for about 6 years now that provides this special, you can see this Tennessee milk label that will go on various dairy products that are produced exclusively with milk produced by dairy farmers within the state of Tennessee. And that's a way for them to do some specific local branding. It's the oversight of that program is through the State Department of Agriculture. I think there are 6 to 8 dairies that use this branding specifically, and some interesting studies have shown that that branding has been very successful in the state of Tennessee. We're going to look at that potential for that in the state of Kentucky when we look at some of our market research. So just the last thing to sort of follow up with on the local product scene is that from the small farm producer, there is a very high interest in how do we differentiate ourselves through branding. Is it a state farm brand, a state farm estate branding program that specifically promotes the name of a specific farm? Lots of questions around sort of legitimizing the local branding, and this question about where does the product come from very specifically in terms of the value connection that it's going to make with the consumers that they're trying to reach to. And so I'm introducing this term proximity here that you'll see will make sense here shortly. Why might that be important? And we see with other products that more and more retailers are starting to use this this kind of definition. It's the old food miles thing, and it's got the food miles has a lot of problems with it in terms of what it represents, but in terms of helping the consumer make a connection to a farmer or producer that's in their community, this can be very powerful. You can see this 5 miles away sign over here, Whole Foods over here on the right. This is one of our larger health food grocers in the United States, has a sign when you walk in the store defining local as being within a 100-mile radius there to try to communicate there. But I've even noticed while I've been out here in the Devon, Cornwall areas, even up in the Gloucestershire exchange, seeing lots of great examples where the kind of proximity of the farm to where the consumer is picking up that product to communicate this kind of sense of community is something that is really picked up in some of the merchandising and promotion set that we see here. This was right here on campus, this cider 40 miles away, this product, this Cotswold Gold, 18 miles away from the Gloucestershire Center service center, similar with that asparagus. And so it can be a really effective way to help provide a sense of community engagement, local, to the consumers that are looking for those products. I'll introduce this, just jumping, pulling something up from ahead that we'll look at a little bit later, but this is something that came out of our recent survey that we did of a little over 800 dairy product consumers in the state of Kentucky, and asking them to think about, well, how do you think about this definition of local? And quite interestingly, we see some differences by age. We see maybe a little bit of difference depending on urban and rural, but the age one was especially striking to me. But people have some different ideas about what local means. You know, do you have a mile radius that would define what that local looks like? What we tended to see overall is we have roughly almost 45–50% of the people were saying produced within 100 miles is how we would think about a local. So a fairly rigorous measure there. So we'll come back to that. It was part of our thinking about how do we do the branding with respect to promoting that. So a couple of things about the carbon impacts, and of course, I think really appropriate here for this audience, and so much that we could say. Dairy and the livestock production systems particularly are seeing this as a really significant issue here in our current agricultural systems. As I mentioned earlier, just how critical those animal production systems are in terms of how much they're contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And a big part of that, there is certainly a carbon issue, but a big part of it is methane. And it's led to looking at these different kinds of calculators that allow people to be able to compare different proteins or different milks, for example, as you can see over here, to see the kind of impacts that are had between products. And very understandably, we have many folks in the climate smart conversation space promoting choosing a certain kind of diet as a way for consumers to appropriately help provide a positive impact here. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that maybe there are some opportunities for those farmers that are producing certain kinds of crops or livestock to adopt better management practices that allow themselves to lower their relative carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emission footprint, if you will. And we've already seen this being taken up. A pretty progressive program by Tyson with branding. The California Dairy Commission has developed a standard for their producers out there, doing a lot of branding and merchandising and messaging around their kinds of impacts. And of course, with any one of these products, as you might expect, you're going to have low impact systems and high impact systems depending on the production system, the surrounding climate, the upstream and downstream supply chain partnerships. In the livestock spaces, the manure management systems especially are critical. And so we're not really going to, in the context of this conversation, necessarily go into all the details of, well, what exactly could constitute a moving the needle in a positive way to reduce the impact of various livestock productions. Lots of great people are working on this. I've got a citation here, but I'm also aware of some folks in the feed sector, some of the animal nutrition sector that are looking at feed-based solutions, pasture and grazing solutions. There are so many different ways to look at this problem that will need to be the topic of another conversation. But I want to just put out there that because this greenhouse gas emission is becoming such a high profile deal for livestock and for dairy particularly, it has the potential to be something really valuable as a way to communicate and message to consumers about better practices that are going on to do this. As I say, we've seen a lot of different programs that have picked up on this to try to promote better understanding, better education around carbon impacts and greenhouse gas emissions from different products. There's a very clever dining branding program that's put together by the University of California, Berkeley, out on the West Coast back in the United States. And students can get online, see the cafeteria a menu for the day, and they'll see every one of their menu items is labeled with one of these green, yellow, or red CO2 icons that shows carbon footprint. In this case, they're looking at equivalent miles driven that would come from that particular product that's there. Very clever. But on a much bigger scale, Tyson, one of our biggest livestock processors in the United States, has introduced this brazen beef. And so kind of trying to do this countercharge against a lot of the negative criticism that's come against the livestock industry generally, trying to come up with their own climate-friendly label that tries to communicate to consumers, here are the efforts that they're doing. They make the claim that they've been able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 10% in the livestock production systems that participate in this particular program. But I think more interestingly, it has received the attention of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and basically recognizing the legitimacy of that label. And I think we're going to start to see more and more of these kinds of labels, certifications for these kinds of labels, and programs that I think will be really important parts of conversation as we kind of move forward around this discussion of labels, branding, and climate smart food. So I want to use that as kind of a background to set the stage then for the research work that we did, and kind of move here to thinking about framing an evaluation through a choice experiment of Kentucky dairy products consumers, a choice experiment that would allow us to explore consumer value for different kinds of local labeling, for different kinds of carbon footprint impact measures, and to test a couple of things. Do we expect that there might be any kind of variation across different types of products, ice cream versus yogurt versus cheeses, et cetera? To also explore, might there be some differences in how urban consumers view some of these measures as opposed to rural consumers? And then finally, where I want to land here is just to show you a model that we've used that I think very helpfully takes into account the wide range of attitudes and preferences, and allowing us to kind of classify different kinds of customers and get a sense of who those customers are, how big are those segments. And I think that can be really helpful as we're trying to develop various promotion and messaging programs around these ideas to consumer groups. I've provided here what I think are some really, really helpful additional resources there. And Alina, I know, is going to share these out later, so I encourage you to follow up with any of those resources. But so to this choice experiment with a choice experiment, what one does is basically look at a couple of selected important attributes and try to isolate the marginal value that a consumer is going to place on the presence of one attribute versus another. And typically these are what we call credence attributes. These credence attribute means it's something that a consumer values around a product, but without some kind of a label connected to it, they may not be able to really be either aware or feel confident that that attribute is present in their product. And so certainly things like the location of where that product was produced and the kind of environmental impact that a product would have really benefit from this kind of labeling. The thing that is kind of nice about a choice experiment like this as you move toward willingness to pay is that you can use different price levels and you can tease out the marginal dollar value, the willingness to pay that a consumer would have for some of these different attributes that we'll get to look at here shortly. In the thinking about our local promotion, we've got three different branding classifications that we wanted to look at. One was this, similar to the Tennessee program, this made with 100% Kentucky milk. We picked this kind of somewhat arbitrarily, but we created this logo ourselves, this 100 miles local label, and then the Kentucky Proud brand. And I should qualify up front here, because you'll see this important here shortly, is that the Kentucky Proud brand is a real existing, very well supported brand name. And even though it's a little bit more nebulous in terms of how it defines a local product, it is very well recognized and valued by consumers and supported with a lot of merchandising and promotion support in stores. Very high brand recognition. The carbon footprint indicator, there are several different interesting measures that are used. We chose to use this green light, red light indicator as a kind of a simple way to see for this product the kind of relative impact there. And we chose these price measures here for 4 different products: butter, yogurt, ice cream, and cheddar cheese in this case. Choosing a unit size that would be approximately comparable price-wise across all 4 of those different products. And so as we're going to look at, are there willingness to pay differences for some of these attributes across those products? That allows us to do that a little easier when they're priced similarly. There's a lot I can say about the kind of methods and process around the modeling that we're going to look at here, the multinomial logit and the latent class modeling. I'll have a few slides and certainly happy to follow up with folks later. But the kind of basic approach here is that we randomize a series of choice cards. And so what we wind up having is each participant randomly is presented with either butter, yogurt, ice cream, or cheddar first, and they're given 4 choice cards that look something like this. And they have an option to choose A, B, or neither product. And product A and product B each have a price that corresponds to it. And so they're presented with a combination of different attributes and prices for 4 different butter options, 4 different yogurt options, etc. And using this kind of a block design, fractional block design program, we can come up with a way where with a large enough population of people that are doing the survey, a lot of experiments and choices are made that we can collect and identify then these marginal values of these different attributes that I'll show you here shortly. before I jump into those very specific results, one of the things that I think is important to kind of also have in context here. Part of the survey that we did, we wanted to see with these different kinds of value labels, how important are those? How much attention? And so people had the option with each one of these labels generally to say, do not care, sometimes pay attention, or always pay attention. And what we're reporting here in this table is the percent of those 827 shoppers that said they always pay attention to those things. And a couple of things to just quick highlight here in this. You can see that older shoppers and rural shoppers tended to put a much higher value around local and the Kentucky Proud measure, which we find kind of interesting. The carbon footprint measure is, as you can see there, is relatively low compared to some of the other value concepts. But I think there's multiple things going on here. One is it's a relatively new concept out into our food market here currently. It is interesting to see that there is a slightly higher measure as you start to look at some of our younger consumers. You can see with organic, particularly a label that's been around for a long time, younger consumers place a much higher indication of how much they're paying attention to those. But what this is suggesting here is that we can see already some evidence of what we call heterogeneity of values. Different consumer groups are placing different values on different kinds of attributes. And this is going to be important as we pull this together here at the end to think about how do those values cluster and how do those consumer segments cluster as we look at a statistical method that we can take to look at those things. When we do a willingness to pay model, and we're trying to take all those choice experiments, over 9,000 choices that are choice experiments that are done collectively by that group of 827 individuals. We do basically a regression that looks at for each one of these products is a different regression for butter, for cheese, for yogurt, and for ice cream. And what we draw out of that then is from this mixed logit regression model, these coefficients are really kind of difficult to interpret aside from the fact that you can tell the statistical significance and the sign is kind of telling about what the magnitude and the degree of direction of willingness to pay is going to look like. When we do a willingness to pay calculation, the very nice thing about this mixed logit regression model is that we can do an estimate of the specific Kentucky only milk, the 100 miles measure, and those measures are done in reference to a base of the Kentucky Proud, which is basically held in the intercept value. Similar kind of a thing, you see the low carbon footprint, medium carbon footprint. Those are willingness to pay measures in reference to the high carbon footprint value that you would see there. And the willingness to pay measure is basically the negative of the intercept term divided by the price coefficient that you can see there. And so as we convert that into this willingness to pay value, we can see as we translate that into dollar values, if we think about those first two lines as representing the local branding, what that's basically telling us is that the Kentucky only milk and even the produced within 100 miles, people are willing to pay actually less for those local branding designations than they are for the Kentucky Proud brand, which is the baseline. And a little bit surprisingly to me, because the 100 miles radius, there is a very narrow catchment region around which somebody would have a connection to their local farm. That's not striking consumers as much as the Kentucky Proud brand itself. Again, that's a very well supported brand, high level of recognition, and these other brands are admittedly hypothetical, but more rigid in their definition. Look at the carbon impacts is also kind of interesting. So these are comparing the low carbon footprint measure to the high carbon footprint. And so if a label has a low carbon footprint label indicator on it, what that's saying is for butter, those consumers are willing to pay 77 cents more per unit for that product. If it's a medium carbon footprint, it's only 29 cents. And so it sort of makes sense across the spectrum there. The ice cream tends to get a slightly higher boost in terms of people's willingness to pay for the low carbon footprint relative to the others. But really, in terms of magnitude across each one of these attributes, they're actually quite strikingly very similar. And so part of our test to see, was there a lot of difference between products? It doesn't really appear to be that there is that much significant difference in terms of how consumers might value these attributes by product type. Well, let me just, in our time remaining, just touch on a couple of other I think, somewhat interesting hypotheses that are pointing us to some different directions here. This basically allows us to see the percent change that's taking place from the median, or from the mean price that we have for each one of these products. You remember our $3.99, $4.99, $5.99 per unit. And so we're looking at that willingness to pay price. And so people are basically willing to pay for the carbon footprint 15 to 20% more relative to the high carbon footprint for these value-added products. But I want to just touch very briefly on some other kinds of things. Now that we have this data, there's a lot of really interesting things that we can tease out of this. And one of the things that we can look at in thinking about those heterogeneous impacts is, might we expect to see, based on what we saw from those earlier data, that urban residents might have different values than rural consumers. Kentucky is a very rural state. We only have 4 million people in a massive land area that covers 2 time zones. There are just a few counties that would be classified as urban, depending on which sort of geographic classification that you're using. In this case, we used 100,000 residents per county. Our counties are very, very small, way smaller than here in England. But as you can see, 7 are urban. The rest of the 120 counties that we have in the state are all very, very rural. What we did is, to be able to look at this, we basically pooled all the products together into essentially treating them essentially the same as products, recognizing that we didn't see big differences across products for either the local sourcing or for the climate smart branding. But what I want to draw your attention to here is back into the regression model here. As we create these interaction terms, where we create a dummy variable for the urban consumer and multiply that by the Kentucky milk, the miles for the local branding. Those variables there were not significant, no clear local branding difference for the urban consumers. But when we look down at those measures where we're looking at the climate smart branding, we actually do see positive and statistically significant, stronger carbon footprint, climate smart branding preference for those urban consumers, which, I think has some pretty, not terribly surprising, but pretty important implications, I think, for our folks that are doing the marketing, merchandising, distribution, to recognize those urban consumers especially are going to place that premium on those climate smart branding label options. The last thing I'll just want to mention here, just in our last closing minutes, wish I had even a little bit more time, but this is truly something that we're unpacking still as we speak. But one of the ways that we can get at identifying subclasses of the consumers, the 827 consumers that participated in this, is using a variation on this mixed logit regression model, something called a latent class model. This is a widely used statistical tool. We see it in all kinds of different disciplines, certainly in social sciences, but increasingly in medical research, healthcare research, and other places where we're trying to identify subclasses of consumers that are clustering in certain ways around the key variables that we're looking at within a regression. What we found in our study here is that adapting that mixed logit model to allow for individuals to be assigned to different classes based on the clustering of their responses to those core local and climate smart branding variables that we looked at. We basically see 4 different classes that emerge. And what I'll start by pointing out here is that we can even identify how big each one of these classes is based on this distribution underneath. So it's the latent class model is a very powerful tool that helps us to look at within these subgroups, what are their different kinds of preferences, and then how might we, of course, then think about targeting them. Quite interestingly, we can start actually way over on the right, this kind of price first, price sensitive consumer. They really aren't willing to pay much more for anything. There's no real difference between the climate smart branding from the higher higher carbon footprint brand, and similarly with the local branding. But what we do see for the climate smart branding is that we see this second class and even this third class are actually fairly similar. One, we could point to one as being based on the value of the coefficient being slightly higher in the low carbon footprint impact for the high Kentucky Proud high carbon footprint level. That makes up about 34% of the consumers. That next group over with the moderate carbon footprint doesn't place quite as much value on the Kentucky Proud label, and they're a little bit closer to indifferent between the different local branding options. But the climate smart branding is still important for that group. The group over to the left where the climate smart branding is maybe somewhat less important is a smaller group. It's only about 17%. But in this case, the relative value of the local branding is somewhat higher. A really nice tool that we're able to use to be able to identify the different classes, how much they place a preference on some of these different attributes. And it's sort of just to kind of pull things together here on this last slide. There's a lot that we're going to be able to tease out of this latent class model now where we can look at for the individuals that are identified with each one of these 4 classes. We can now identify the values, the demographics, the urban-rural characteristics, and really help those folks that are marketing both for local products and for climate smart branding, targeting each one of those groups. We see a big group around the climate smart branding in terms of the folks that really value this. And even though these are hypothetical labels, it's pointing, I think, ahead to some opportunity to do more research around other kinds of climate smart branding labels and maybe stronger translation of meaning. We have to think with any of this kind of branding, these are hypothetical brands that we've developed, but if we think about actually implementing some things like this, what would be the mechanisms for enforcing? What constitutes a baseline? What makes a product high carbon footprint versus low carbon footprint, and who develops those and enforces those standards? I think those are real practical next steps of taking this to some kind of a practical business use. From a farm production point of view, I think there's a lot of opportunity to get in and better understand sustainable farming practice systems and their corresponding impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and with the potential opportunity to provide some points of differentiation from the larger commodity products that maybe aren't able to do that quite as well. So, yeah, I guess at this point, Aliana, I guess I'd welcome folks to share some comments and feedback. As we say in the United States, they can throw rotten fruit, but only virtually. But I'd love to hear if folks have some ideas or reaction to any of these things that we've discussed here today.
Great, thank you, Timothy, so much. That was really, really fascinating. To everyone in the Zoom room, please feel free to send through your questions in the chat box or raise your hand, and the questions will come to you. I had one. As moderator, I'll give myself the first question. The generalizability of these findings is really interesting to me. Where do you think these could be generalized to? Do you think they're quite Kentucky specific? Or do you think they could be generalized to other parts of America, or even maybe England, do you think?
Yeah, well, I would say one of the very straightforward things that can be done in terms of future research is, I feel like we have a good approach, a good model that would allow us to explore these kinds of preferences within different market groups, market regions, however we would want to define those. Just my very general sense of things is that the British consumer is actually well ahead of the American consumer in terms of awareness and interest around the climate smart branding. I feel like our American consumers are pretty well behind in that. And I think with any kind of a branding program, there's a corresponding promotion program, education program, definitions and standards and education that has to take place to help people appreciate what does that brand mean. But I think in terms of how generalizable is this, I think that a lot of our Western markets that are struggling with these issues of climate change and climate smart considerations and impacts on all kinds of food and parts of our economy, it's a fast coming issue.
Great, thank you. And Harry, I think you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Tim. Sorry for joining late. I had trouble getting in the meeting. You were talking about the Kentucky Smart as a brand versus the 100 Mile as a brand, and focusing on how one is still theoretical and more underdeveloped for that reason. I wonder also what you might have to say about the fact that Kentucky, it's not just a brand, it's a, you know, it has a deeper history, a cultural identity, as many place names do, before they're turned into a brand. And to what extent do you think it is that's significant vis-a-vis just the length of time that a particular scheme is sort of up and running? Not to mention sort of dimension. You know, one of the things that comparison between Kentucky Proud and 100 Miles begs is you know, dimension. I wonder what you would have to say about place names that are of smaller dimensions versus larger dimensions, and you know, the potential branding you know, that lies within those place names.
Yeah, no, I think those are all very fair questions, and the geography of branding is, you know, I think something that continues to be a sticky point for a lot of the local products branding stuff. One of the things I didn't really get into, just for time limitations, was we actually looked at the difference between border counties versus non-border counties. So a county that's right on the northern edge of Ohio, near Cincinnati, just, you know, they may identify more even with markets in another state. They may work across in another state. And so, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of moving parts. I don't know if that's really helping to answer your question there. I guess one of the things I feel like still needs to be explored and has a lot of opportunity is still that farms identifying their product to their community, whether it's through miles or through connection by name to a particular community, that's different from a state branding space that is actually such a wide, you know, I ask this question a lot of times with some of my farmers, is made in the USA local? I notice on a lot of British dairy products, they make a big deal about this is British milk, and it's like, okay, I guess that's a place. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if, Harry, if I'm answering your question fairly, but I think there is an issue of time and recognition that comes with brand. That's just lodging a place in people's mind too.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really complicated question, and yeah, what you said is really interesting. So I didn't expect an answer that, you know, completely closed it off.
Yeah, fair enough.
Great, and do we have any more questions from the audience? We did have one in the chat then. What KPIs can one use to measure the success of climate smart marketing initiatives? And that question is from Jocelyn.
Yeah, Jocelyn, maybe if you could help me understand what you're looking at there for types of KPIs. I guess I need a little help with what you're. I'm showing my ignorance here, I guess, so I'm not sure what you mean by a KPI.
Jocelyn, your microphone is unmuted, but we still can't hear you for some reason. No, we can't hear you. And maybe your laptop itself is muted instead of the Zoom room. You can always type the question into the chat box as well if that's easier. In the meantime, I'm guessing you're probably writing the question into the chat then
Yeah.
if it's still not working.
Yeah.
I also had another question from the farmers' perspectives. Do you have any insight into who was most interested in having climate branding on their products? Obviously, your focus is local, artisanal, but even within that target group, was there some sort of indicator that you noticed or not really?
From the farmer perspective,
Yes.
You know, every farmer is going to tell you they're doing everything they can to be exercising sustainable farming practices. You know, I think to the extent that you know, and really I think this is how it should be, is that to the extent that the market values something, that should catch the attention of the farmer producer community to say there's a market opportunity here. And you know, I think for many of them, you know, they're doing what they can to be as good stewards of their farm and land as possible. But even having a brand, like I was trying to say there earlier, it still needs some kind of a standard that would say, this is what you have to do to qualify to be eligible to use this brand. And I think that's where we're facing kind of the next steps in terms of how something like that might get developed. And I think that would be the level where, obviously, starting with conversations with the farmers there about what could be feasible, but then also, you know, what could be verifiable, authentic, not very onerous in terms of documentation, and sustained kind of year after year. I think that's a challenge with this particular kind of an attribute.
Okay, thank you. Just for the last minute then, Jasleen has responded to KPI performance indicators to measure the success of climate branding. So to repeat her question, what KPIs can one use to measure the success of climate smart marketing initiatives?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think part of it would be, you know, the consumer awareness around those brands. You know, I find it really interesting to look at, particularly across generations, to see the next younger generations of consumers coming up that are being particularly, they're going to be our future leading consumers, to see how those values are connecting within that group. You know, I think in terms of seeing adoption of those brands by farms and small scale food processors themselves, recognizing the value of those brands is a good signal that they recognize that's important to consumers, and that there's an opportunity to change their practices to move into that space. And I think we're starting to see that Tyson initiative, the California Dairy Group, are just a few small examples. We see a lot of that over here in England and Europe already.
Great, thank you. There is one more, I think, in the chat, or of a reflection, I think it is. So I'll just say that before we wrap up. So this is from Irene Williams. I understand what has been done in this research, but I find it profoundly depressing. Maybe as a post-World War II child brought up in times of rationing, I accepted that we could not have whatever we wanted all of the time. I suspect such times may come again when choice is extremely limited or non-existent. As I am also a small-scale, low-intensity Devon beef farmer in my retirement on land unsuitable for much else, I have issues with people dismissing all beef as unsustainable in terms of climate. This is oversimplistic. I think a very good reflection there on a lot of different narratives happening in research and media, probably. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. And you know, I think one of the early slides that I put up there, I think showed within any of these production, including beef, you have a wide range of production systems and their corresponding climate impact. You know, I think where we have the opportunity to, as an agricultural community, as a scientific community, to do something constructive there is to collectively learn what might help us to create a lower impact system. So yeah, do beef production better. I'm a big fan of beef. I didn't want to convey anything like that for Irene there.
Well, what a point to end it on. Do beef better.
That's it.
Thank
I
you
love that.
very, very much for everyone for coming today. This talk has been recorded, so it'll go on our YouTube. So please keep an eye out there, and the slides will be circulated along with that YouTube video. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.